The original Mass Effect's development and production was one that certainly pushed the creative minds at BioWare to their limits, so much so that the game's director, Casey Hudson, was filling in wherever he could to squash out bugs or fine-tune some systems. There were many concepts in the first Mass Effect that couldn't make it, and the lack of experience in creating shooters was apparent in the final product. It was an ambitious project and one that resulted in many compromises, but while Mass Effect did have its issues I've pointed out and others I haven't, there's no denying that its introduction into the gaming media was a fantastic start. It was met with praise and acclaim from critics and audience members alike, especially for its ambitious, fresh new story filled with characters that captivated audiences into its epic experience. Certainly far from a perfect game, Mass Effect as a narrative, as an experience, is a significant factor that led to its commercial and critical success. Following this success would be easy in theory, but in practice might prove to be a bit challenging. Sequels in concept are relatively simple. Create something that's better than the first, something that improves on its gameplay and story without alienating what made it special to begin with. That's about as plain as I can make it. But as simple as this might be in concept, putting this into practice would be something easier said than done. Mass Effect in particular had a lot to improve for its gameplay and AI, something that likely required a reconstructing of how its cover and shooting mechanics functioned. While the experience wasn't downright broken, the game often felt underwhelming with how unintelligent enemies were, how little impact guns had aside from the amount of numbers attached to them, and squad mates felt useless outside of having some broken powers. This would all be considered in developing Mass Effect 2, which I remind you was the first game I played in the trilogy. 10 years ago, I was in love with this game for its combat, and not much else. I liked its characters and hated to see them die, but I seldom thought to explore, get to know each of them, or have conversations. Renegade Shepard gave me something to laugh at in between combat, but everything else was just in the way of me landing on a planet, going somewhere, and gunning down some aliens. So it's time to see how Mass Effect 2 holds up as a sequel compared to the first game, and how its experience in my distant memories compares to what I feel now. This is a blast from the past, the Mass Effect trilogy with Mass Effect 2 as this video's focus, replayed through the Legendary Edition on PC. Released in 2010 on the Xbox 360 and personal computer, and later on the PlayStation 3, Mass Effect 2's development had one of the earliest initiations possible, starting days before the first game had even hit shelves back in 2007, and at the same time, all of the work that had gone into Mass Effect 1's world building and engine creation, which had taken up a sizable amount of its development time, went straight into saving time and energy in the making of Mass Effect 2. And with the feedback of the first game well underway, the team compiled a list of every single bit of criticism and suggestions they could find, ultimately narrowing it down to over 40 different categories. It's no coincidence that a majority of interviews and goals cited by the developers, and even one of the co-founders, was centered on both how its gameplay would be changed and what they were going to do with the game's story. Arguably, these were the weakest and strongest things of the original Mass Effect. How are they going to keep the story going strong, and how are they going to improve the typically lackluster gameplay? These questions were at the forefront of Mass Effect 2's development. Starting with its story and world, well, I'll let the documentary speak for itself.
Mass Effect 2 is a darker story.
It's a dark second chapter.
Dark underbelly, dark of darkness.
It's almost like the Empire Strikes Back of the Mass Effect trilogy.
In case it wasn't obvious enough, Mass Effect 2 intended to be a darker story. The original game's aspiration was to have the player be dazzled, bright-eyed, and a bit naive until they discover some of the galaxy's darker secrets. As humanity's entrance on the galactic stage through Commander Shepard, a lot of Mass Effect 1's world building was centered around spectacle, discovery, and brighter moments that inevitably led to some more disturbing lore. In Mass Effect 2, that underbelly would be given center stage, venturing beyond Council space and into the Terminus systems. But aside from being the darker story or the Empire Strikes Back of the Mass Effect trilogy, Mass Effect 2 appropriately sought to be something more. More to explore, more to discover, and a more personal story. players would be taken on new adventures to regions of the galaxy they had never heard of before or only got small hints of in the first game. Whether this is full involvement with Cerberus, exploring the Krogan homeworld of Tuchanka, or finally seeing the politics of the migrant fleet in person, Mass Effect 2 intended to bring players on a journey to locations that had their own distinctive look, feel, and color palette to make them stand out from one another. The story would involve something more personal to the player as well, no longer just about being put in the spotlight on the galactic stage, but carrying out a singular suicide mission. Much of the game's time would be spent on recruiting and getting to know the larger cast of Mass Effect 2 for said mission. These included some of the most ruthless, badass, and toughest characters in the galaxy, all hired to work as a team, but might not get along with each other or even Commander Shepard. Interacting with these squad mates and NPCs would carry with it a similar weight that it did in the first game. Arguably one of the least contended aspects of its predecessor, Mass Effect 2's ambition was to give players more of what they loved about the writing and interaction of the original game. For starters, interrupts were once again said to be present, initially cut content in Mass 1. This median title is also where striking emphasis was being placed on the consequences of decisions. Minor decisions and expressions would be made throughout the entire story, but there would be ones that carried more dire ramifications. While present in the first game, Mass Effect 2 had more lives at stake, even Shepard's, and other decisions that promised to forward consequences into the finale. Mass 1 had a similar promise, but as the trilogy's beginning and with next to no planning on future games, it was likely difficult to focus on what these decisions were and what sorts of consequences they would have without a concrete future. Unlike this approach, developers of Mass Effect 2 were sure to emphasize the importance of making major decisions that could affect the future, acknowledging that past decisions in Mass 1 would carry over as well, claiming that it was something never to have been done before. One of the most stressed outcomes, for instance, would be who lived and who died. The Paragon-Renegade dichotomy would make a return, still described quite vaguely by anyone involved in the project to be ruthless or compassionate, or badass or heroic. The emphasis, however, was once again placed on choice, albeit not exactly as one might imagine. Greg Zeschuk stated the player would direct Shepard. They would be making decisions, but Shepard was intended to do some things that would still take the player by surprise, doing or saying something that could result in not quite the intended outcome. Something I'll say right now doesn't sound too promising for a game where decisions are supposed to have weight and impact. Nonetheless, Mass 2's story and dialogue objectives were by and large headed in the right direction. Expand on the established universe, and take advantage of the levity interactions had in the first game straight into the second. Most appropriately was how Mass 2 delved into the feedback from the first game about its combat and exploration. The core principles carried over. Third-person RPG cover shooter with powers, commanding and directing squad mates, pausing and taking waitful approaches to combat, doing it in real time, leveling up, and customization. There was little promised for anything brand new, but there was an abundance of explanations for how things were changing for the better. If dark was the word used most frequently to express the tone of Mass 2's story, intense was the same for its combat. Christina Norman, Mass 2's lead game designer, said that the first game was an action RPG, and 2 was crafted as a shooter RPG. During the earliest stages of Mass 2's development, the shooter-inept team at BioWare worked exclusively on Mass 2's gunplay, disabling any and all RPG mechanics. They wanted the game to be a fun shooter first, and have its RPG elements be supplements to the experience. Whereas the first game had unlimited ammo, Mass 2 would use the thermal clip system to function as a reload mechanic to speed up the combat, as they put it. Mass 1 also had dozens of different kinds of weapons that could be customized, and had clear-cut levels to supplement the RPG idea of this system. While sound in theory, this led to an abundance of useless weapons and sifting through inventory screens that even the developers of Mass 2 had begun to hate. So, they removed all of that, and each weapon was given its own special design, could be shared across squad mates eligible for use, and were intended to have their own impact and distinct feel. Headshots were also made a thing. Just a quick note. The goal in these changes to a similar combat system was to refine the shooter part of Mass Effect. In addition to general AI improvement, both in enemies and in squad mates, gunplay was tailored to be more intense, moment-to-moment, and exciting. Casey Hudson said the result of this would be small changes that felt as though they were a radical redesign. Likewise with ammunition, powers also received a bit of tweaking for the sake of balance. The global cooldown system, as opposed to individual cooldowns, was implemented to prevent the spamming of one power after another to break enemies and turn the endgame into a joke. And then, there was exploration. Criticism of the first game's exploration led to a vastly different approach about how it would be handled in Mass 2, though there was the possibility it wouldn't have been included to begin with. Casey Hudson said the team considered completely abandoning explorable worlds entirely, instead focusing on creating several distinctive planets. Rather than having a large number with little substance, they wanted the explorable worlds to be smaller, fewer, but contain more interesting experiences. Somehow in this mix, there was also the talk of a new vehicle that was supposed to be everything the Mako wasn't. It could strafe, it moved faster, it could target enemies easier, it navigated terrain differently. Like most of what Mass 2 focused on, this new vehicle was BioWare's answer to all of the criticism the Mako received. But there was little more information given on this vehicle. With all of this in mind, Mass 2's objectives had appropriately started on a spreadsheet with different criticisms of features in the first game and wanted to improve on as much as they could, the proper way a sequel should be done. The question is how well this holds up. Mass Effect 2's gameplay, or to be more precise, its gunplay, is what received an abundance of attention for most of its interviews and discussion. Tossing aside the repetitive use of more intense to describe it, just how well does its gunplay hold in comparison to Mass 1? In brief, extremely well. As I said in my first video, what drew me to Mass Effect 2 and away from Mass 1 when I was about a decade younger was its combat and AI. And before I go any further, I'd like to point out that I write all of this in the perspective of a soldier, the class with the most health, access to the most weapons, but with zero biotic and tech powers. Other classes are balanced out to have less weapons, but more powers. But for now, let's move on. Beginning with the weapons and inventory system, Mass 2 abandons its predecessor almost entirely, which I think is for the best. The first game's inventory was little more than junk lying around waiting to be sold until you happened to find or buy a weapon that had more numbers attached to it and was by default better. There were weapons that had unique fire rate and damage values on the Legendary Edition, but there was little variation in their appearance and sound. It was hard to express oneself in combat when all they needed was a weapon with the largest numbers, seldom to coming down to preference. And although you could put in some mods and attachments for customization, not only did it seem to add very little aside from a small damage boost, but it was a system entirely wasted on squad mates that could barely pull a trigger. By contrast, Mass 2's inventory and weapon system puts more emphasis on choice and impact. Weapons that are collected are accessible for anyone that can use them, Shepard included. They're found all over the place, from lying on the ground to being purchased in stores, researched on the Normandy, and in a random pile on the Collector's ship. That one never made any sense to me, but any and all weapons have their own quirks and uses, and are impacted more by personal preference and strategy as opposed to simply outclassing each other by numbers alone. Each weapon is given its own distinct model, image, silhouette, sound effects, and fire rate to make them instantly recognizable and memorable. While some bemoaned the system for taking an exceptional step back from staying true to the more traditional RPG formula of the first game, I wholeheartedly agree with Christina Norman that this is an improvement. The choice has more meaning, the customization allows for expression, and the weapons feel and look fantastic. Nothing beats the feeling of headshotting unsuspecting mercenaries with a sniper rifle whose lore states its recoil is strong enough to shatter a normal human's arm. Or ripping through enemies in close quarters with a shotgun. In sum, every single weapon, from assault rifles to sniper rifles to especially heavy weapons, are all diverse in the best ways possible for their aesthetic and combat usage. The gunplay itself has seen some major improvements to its AI and weight. Mass Effect 2's AI, while not perfect, is still leagues better than the first game and attempts to apply some semblance of combat strategy. Some enemies will try and get in close to apply pressure, they will take advantage of Shepard being out of cover, they'll try and use squad powers to stun you, and in some situations they can flank you. Enemy design also ensures that players are aware of what they're facing and what they can do. Is it something with biotic or tech powers that will stagger you when you pop out of cover? An enemy that will approach you slowly and force you to move if they get too close? Or a heavy weapons guy? It gives some much needed variety that was present in the first game, but had little impact from how easy it was to eliminate targets. Squad AIs are also more aggressive and smart about their positioning, actively avoiding damage and taking cover. They also no longer switch between shooting at nothing and not shooting at all. Weapons each have effectiveness against certain types of enemy health to reward strategic inventory management, and headshots allow precise, skilled play to have devastating outcomes on enemy waves. The introduction of an ammunition system in the form of thermal clips, while a bit sudden and controversial to some people, turns encounters from wasting inaccurate shots or running down hallways gunning with no brakes into something that feels more tense and tactical with every shot fired. Emphasis has also been placed on utilizing cover and sticking to it, though a tad bit more than I would like. Commander Shepard is really squishy in Mass Effect 2, and any area where there's minimal cover, poorly positioned cover, or none at all can turn into a death trap instantaneously. Cover is no longer a safe option like it was in Mass 1, it's a necessity. While this does create some tense situations, more often than not, encounters can be boiled to gunning down a few enemies before playing it safe until Shepard's regenerating health and shields kick in, only to do the same thing again and again until you're victorious. This leaves shotguns oftentimes having minimal use outside of husks or ballsy plays, and powers to be a godsend whenever they're available. Though I wouldn't call this personal criticism something that ruins the game. It's just something that I'm not always a fan of. It's worth noting, however, that biotic and tech classes can have a different flow to them given their abundance of abilities and crowd control and lack of weapons compared to what I was playing. But the straightforward one side versus another arenas only adds to this shoot, duck, repeat pattern that the game notoriously relies on. Zestruck's statements that squad control could allow for ambushing, tactical positioning, and circling around enemies seems a bit out of place when most of the game's combat arenas just allow for Shepard and his squad to slowly mow down and advance on enemies, as getting caught out of cover will lead to a swift death. Even if it's not always as intense as the team wanted it to be, it's still a lot of fun a vast majority of the time and can lead to some wonderfully satisfying or hilarious encounters. Leveling up and progression for Mass 2, in my very biased opinion, has a more natural pacing to it. A lot of the original game's concepts for leveling and points are reworked. Just as the inventory system was completely redone, the amount of powers for each squad member and Shepard has been significantly reduced, including the separate skill trees for different weapon types. But although some fans bemoaned this, just as Casey Hudson said in response, it really comes down to how you define an RPG. Though some of these systems have been removed or tweaked, I think the overall progression and customization of Mass 2 as an RPG is still very much there and superior. With fewer traits and skills to level up in, but more expensive costs as they become more powerful, the impact and progression of these skills becomes more like ascending a staircase than walking up a small incline. There certainly is growth in power, but one that's gradually gained in more impactful choices as opposed to slight increases over time. The biggest leap in power for the original Mass Effect was getting a shiny new gun with a bunch of numbers on it. Skill trees and upgrades with different weapon categories gave 2 to 3% increases in damage with some accuracy slapped onto it. In Mass 2, on the other hand, these come incrementally in the form of upgrades that can boost a weapon's power in increments of 10%. Other upgrades could include enormous boosts to accuracy, headshot damage, health and shields to Shepard and his squad mates, and can come from different ammo types and skill trees. While I have some gripes about how these upgrades are obtained that I'll discuss in a moment, for now I will say that I much prefer this system of progression as opposed to Mass Effect 1's inventory and skills. That's because the impact of these upgrades were certainly felt by the end of the game when I was mowing down collectors with a rifle that had 85% increased damage, another 95% against health and armor, greater accuracy, and could shotgun big baddies without a care in the world. Every one of these upgrades was something I earned and took the time to acquire, and stacking them all together was my choice exclusively. There are many more options for how someone might power up Shepard by the time they reach the game's end, none of which rely on breaking the game and spamming powers or purchasing a high-level weapon. The weapons are the same from beginning to end, but how well upgrades and powers are made use of are exclusively in the hands of the player. While on the surface it might seem stripped down compared to more traditional RPGs in the first game, I think it works fantastic for Mass Effect 2's purpose. Mass Effect's squad power balance and usage have also changed for the better and for a bit of difference. For starters, squad mates have significantly less powers. Unlike in the first game where you might find Liara and Tali with most or all of the biotic and tech powers, and other characters with a smaller hybrid toolkit, every squad member in Mass Effect 2 is given 2 default powers and 1 loyalty power, with few overlaps to who has what. This in turn provides the game with another noticeable emphasis on pronounced choices and customization. How one builds their squad before each mission can have meaningful impact on what sorts of powers can be used to assist the player in each combat encounter. This inadvertently provides some opportunities for replayability, as one's knowledge over what sorts of enemies to expect can encourage clever squad building before each mission. One other thing worth praising is how these powers function when commanding squad mates. They can be used with shortcuts on a controller or hotkeys on a mouse and keyboard. Simply pressing a button on a highlighted enemy aligned with a particular squad mate will cause them to use any powers that can hit whatever the target reticle is on. Unlike in Mass Effect 1, these reactions are instant, hit enemies even when Shepard is in cover, don't need you aiming your weapon right at them so they don't miss like absolute dipshits, and don't even require squad mates to be in line of sight of the target. The game tracks Shepard's line of sight, and if the enemy is in cover, and if their protections have been lowered. If those simple conditions have been met, then a simple push of a button will result in an immediate, effective reaction that speeds up the combat dramatically compared to the first game. An issue I have with these powers, however, is just how often enemies are protected by shields and barriers. The game's global cooldown was added to prevent the spamming of powers. I can understand that with how mercilessly stupid Liara was in Mass Effect 1, but a gripe I have about a lot of the biotic powers especially is how they can't be used on targets with shields. By the time an enemy's shield is down, I'm probably just gonna kill it in the next shot or two anyway, especially in the later half of the game when I've made my weapons more overpowered than actual squad powers. This nullified the need for skills like throw, pull, or shockwave, and inadvertently made me use tech skills like overload or incinerate more, with the occasional warp. With their ability to damage enemy shields, barriers, and armor at a single push of a button, it's hard to imagine an alternative. Shoot an enemy until their shields are down, use crowd control on them, and then shoot them again? It's not an impossibility and can ensure a target dies before it decides to go back into cover, but its occurrence and usefulness was simply dwarfed in the face of skills that instantly damage a particular type of enemy health. But one other thing I appreciate is how ammunition mods of Mass Effect 1 have been replaced with their own powers, activated on the battlefield at the push of a button, and providing bonus damage or crowd control effects depending on the type of enemy being shot at. While I would have loved if there wasn't a cooldown from switching between these ammo types so I could instantly go from cryo to incendiary ammo in a single clip, it was probably for balance reasons. Moving on from power usage and balance, I'd say that Mass Effect 2's lowest point of combat is its bosses, or lack thereof. I'm not certain what I would consider a boss since some of these enemies are encountered more than once, but whether it's a Praetorian, a Ymir mech, Scions, gunships, whatever, Mass Effect 2's bosses, or slightly larger than average enemies, are literally just bullet sponges made to severely punish any slight misstep in the cover system. While the Praetorian can add a little bit of tension with how it gets closer and closer and actively goes around a corner, Ymir mechs just stand there gunning at you without ever hitting a single shot. These provide little legitimate challenge, and are more often than not just enemies to force you to use or waste heavy ammo, ammo for other guns, or just be an excuse to kill you for poking your head out at the wrong time. Nothing I'd call exceptionally difficult or all that challenging most of the time. Just boring, and kind of kills the game's ordinary fast pacing. Launching a mushroom cloud at some of these enemies by the game's end, however, priceless. Mass Effect 2's environments and arenas also leave a lot to be desired for their variety in gameplay. Locations are aesthetically diverse and instantly recognizable, but often play exactly the same. With a single exception, most levels could be interchangeable. The vast galaxy to explore and different planets and locations don't provide for any sort of environment gameplay intersection, which is kind of a shame because I see so many possibilities. Samara's recruitment mission takes slight advantage of this with the placement of red sand, something that will explode and boost biotic powers, but can lead to death if the player becomes overexposed. It's a neat idea, but never amounts to much, especially for a player who isn't a biotic. The finest exception to this, in my opinion, is the game's best mission, Tally's recruitment on Haestrom. Instantly recognizable from the galaxy map by its star, Haestrom advantageously uses its environment by pitting the player on a world with a star that has started dying faster than expected and is now emitting more radiation than is considered safe. As a result of this, any areas exposed to direct sunlight will burn through Shepard's shields. This is brilliant. It not only provides an unusual atmosphere and visual design, but intersects it with the gameplay. Cover and movement is even more of a deliberate choice than it initially was because of the shield overheating. It makes player decisions on pushing forward or staying on the defensive impactful, and the level itself can oftentimes offer several different paths to the same end location for further control in the player's hands. All of this culminates in a battle against another bullet sponge, unfortunately, but at the very least it does have a unique way of reaching it in its branching paths. Not only that, but the decision to have Rieger fight with you doesn't just result in his death immediately because Renegade is the path that lets people die. It's only if the player doesn't reach the Colossus fast enough before Rieger drops his shields. Brilliant! Control is in the player's hands and not just an unpredictable outcome from a single decision. Narratively, visually, and gameplay, Haestrom is, in my opinion, Mass Effect 2 at its finest. In spite of some of the complaints I have about Mass Effect 2's over-reliance on cover systems, a few minor power usefulness issues, few arena diversity options, and some subpar boss fights, the game is still incredibly fun. Most of what I mentioned so far is an improvement to Mass Effect 1 in some way or another, or is something that just needed a little more creativity behind it. But when all is said and done, Mass Effect 2's gunplay is fantastic. One part of the game that has significantly taken a turn for the worse, however, is its exploration. Recall how in Mass Effect 1, the goal was to tempt players into exploring and venturing out into the unknown, finding uninhabitable planets to land on, and on those planets, the player could drive around in a space rover, mine some minerals, collect a few things, shoot up an outpost, or maybe they'll run into something interesting. The planets, while diverse and looking gorgeous, were often barren with not many fun things to do. Every once in a while, an interesting side quest or a bit of lore and information would pop up, but for the most part, the galaxy was just full of unexplorable worlds or planets that just didn't have much going for them. Now recall how Mass Effect 2 sought to do the opposite. Make explorable planets have smaller bits to walk around in, but give a much more compelling reason to explore these sections, both gameplay and story, with a brand new vehicle said to be better than the Mako. While the first game's system did have some problems, it did show potential. Mass Effect 2, on the other hand, is a gargantuan step backwards. If you don't count loyalty missions in the mix, that is. Starting out with planetary exploration, Mass 2 does make a slight improvement where you can manually pilot the Normandy around star clusters and nebulae. While something minor and doesn't add too much, it does add a little bit of immersion to the game as opposed to pulling up a map and dictating where you want to fast travel to. And some of these nebulae look absolutely gorgeous. What you do when you find these planets, however, is you scan them for minerals. That's just about it. The first game had a similar system where you just pushed a button and it'd give you resources, so while the sequel system is a direct upgrade to this is almost exclusively what you will do for most planets you pull up against. Find a place where the graph spikes, send a probe, rinse, and repeat. Typically, the mineral-rich worlds are the terrestrial planets, so unless you're a completionist, there is very little reason to pull up next to a gas giant. But this mining does serve a purpose, an essential one actually, upgrading yourself and your ship. While I did say I enjoy how the upgrade system works in its impact, I'm not particularly a fan of how the upgrades are found and how you research them. Nearly every single upgrade in this game is just found sitting there out in the open in a shop or put behind an easy hacking minigame. Acquiring the resources to invest in these upgrades simply involves the mining process I just mentioned. Find a random upgrade somewhere in a level, go to a bunch of planets, deplete them of resources. Congratulations, Shepard is slightly more powerful, all for the low price of 5,000 iridium, and maybe a few dozen thousand credits if you went shopping for them. While I'm glad that exploration has a purpose tied to player progression and power, this certainly isn't how I would have wanted it to be. It's a step backwards in nearly every way possible, and across the dozens of planets I explored, about 5 of them could actually be landed on. On those planets, the side content could be something like this: kill 3 bullet sponges to get credits, solve a mediocre puzzle to get some credits, or kill a few mercs for some credits. Did I mention how for most of these there isn't a single bit of spoken dialogue? No quip from Commander Shepard or his squad mates? No stopping and talking to someone? No opportunities to intimidate or charm someone to avoid violence? What about the added bit of DLC where you can visit the Normandy's crash site? That's a goldmine for great character moments, conversations, and reminiscing about the first game. You land on a frozen world and collect dog tags. And Commander Shepard doesn't utter a single sentence while doing all of this by himself. I started to miss the Mako. But this is under the assumption that one doesn't count the loyalty missions as side quests. Ray Mazika thought this way in one of his interviews, and while I can certainly see the legitimacy in it, the fact of the matter is that the disparity between planetary exploration and anomalies alongside loyalty missions is far too great to ever consider these in the same category. In my opinion, loyalty missions are a part of the main story, but are not mandatory for progression. If they are part of side quests, then they're amazing. They have great stories, allow you to explore new sections of new planets entirely, have some good combat scenarios, unlock brand new powers for each squad member, and are just damn good fun. But when compared to just scan this planet, land on it, and kill 3 mechs for credits, the difference of quality makes me question why these 2 bits of content, with vastly different amounts of effort put into them, could ever be put in the same categorization. The point of all of this ranting is that while I think Mass Effect 1's planetary exploration had a lot of breadth and little depth, its sequel takes a step backwards in lacking both. As a whole, Mass Effect 2's combat and exploration takes several steps forward that change the game for the better, and a few steps back that don't necessarily make it worse, just not as great in areas where it could have been. Space exploration was part of the original game's appeal and promise, and it's a damn shame to see that it returned in one of the most boring and tedious ways imaginable, with little substance and forcibly tied to progression that could determine if someone lives or dies during the suicide mission. But as much as I could bitch and moan about it all, Mass Effect 2's gameplay as a whole is well deserving of its praise and is both something that improved on the first game and still showed promise for what the third could bring. Mass Effect's original story and setup was undoubtedly its strongest selling point. An original, brand new science fiction universe crafted by the brilliant minds and artists at BioWare. The months of effort put into bringing this universe to life is what captivated the audience the moment they saw the splendid wonder of the Citadel and kept them hooked as they discovered the galaxy's darker secrets. Its world building, characters, writing, and lore were a fantastic start, and BioWare fittingly had their attention turned for the sequel to expand on what they had established. While the first game had used exterior inspiration for some of its initial concepts, Mass Effect 2 looked almost exclusively at the first game for what could be present in the second. And just as a reminder, they wanted Mass Effect 2 to be
Dark. It was a darker game. Darker kind of. Darker.
Right from the start, this is apparent with the destruction of the Normandy and Shepard's death at the hands of the Collectors. The colors and narrative context of this opening scene excellently establish the shift in tone. And not long afterwards, Mass Effect 2 has the player explore the galaxy's more lawless terminus systems, starting with Omega, which brilliantly juxtaposes the Citadel with its red lighting, griminess, dim atmosphere, and widespread poverty. It's a way of establishing that Mass Effect 2 will give players a chance to see both a whole new side to Shepard and the galaxy. And while some darker plots and themes were present in the first game, they take center stage in the second. Plague epidemics, torture, experiments, family troubles, sexual assault, all of it stands at the core of Mass Effect 2's theme and narrative. These are tied into the bulk of Mass Effect 2's story missions, recruiting and gaining the loyalty of new and old friends. Each recruitment mission has a similar structure, but a genuine sense of mystery to it. With the exception of Tali, the player is given someone to recruit with little information about them, and throughout the level, Shepard gains clues as to who they are based on what they encounter or who they ask, but their identity is kept a secret until it's appropriately revealed. It's sort of a copy-paste formula, but never quite gets stale because of the variety of scenarios Shepard will find to recruit another valuable ally in preparation for the game's final suicide mission. This is the centerpiece and bulk for Mass Effect 2's story content, which is a bit of a downgrade in terms of scale and consequences compared to the first game. Mass Effect 1's climax saw the player saving the entire galaxy in the midst of a starship battle by postponing an invasion that would lead to the complete and utter destruction of all life in the galaxy at the hands of the Reapers. The direness of finding Saren is dramatically heightened at each encounter or location visited, furthering the urgency to stop him while simultaneously gaining more information on what to expect. On the other hand, the sequel builds into encounters with the game's main antagonist figures, the Collectors, who play a similar role to the Geth in Mass Effect 1. But in the first game, there was still a sinister force pulling the strings and presenting itself as a very real threat in the form of Sovereign and a personal rival to Shepard in the form of Saren. None of these strengths make it into Mass Effect 2's story until the final moments. No, Harbinger doesn't count. The first game was Shepard's journey in a larger galaxy. His story, his growth, his resolve, his relationship and contrast to his foil, Saren, and his resolve against Sovereign. Mass Effect 2 doesn't have this. His grudge is against the Collectors, mindless aliens with minimal speaking roles, and the Collector General, in reality Harbinger, doesn't interact with Shepard. They have no personal dialogue with each other. Harbinger acknowledges Shepard and stands in his way, but the two of them only interact once in a DLC that just recycles the final battle of the Citadel in a downscaled way. Sovereign wasn't the most fantastically written villain in gaming, but his interaction with Shepard does do a lot both for himself and the Commander. Meanwhile, Shepard doesn't even make a verbal comment about how Harbinger is able to take control of his minions the first time it happens. What Mass Effect 2's story leads to is a bit of a deficit. The fight against the Collectors isn't as much about the entire galaxy as it is about human colonies. It lacks the same sense of urgency and scale as it did in the first game. The Reaper's arrival isn't thought of until the game's final moments and in the DLC I just spoke of moments ago. But again, it's almost exactly what happened in Mass Effect's final act, with slightly different context and a smaller scale. Mass Effect 2 is more of a personal struggle and an ensemble exploration. The strength of the narrative is more in who is with you, and not necessarily what you're doing or going up against. There are personal stakes and lives at risk, but that's where they end. Personally. To be fair, this was the intent of the game, and it worked pretty well. But even with that, the stakes of the main story don't quite evolve from stopping a galactic threat like they were in the first game, not even postponing it. The colonies abducted are already gone by the time he gets there, or are in the process of happening. The Collectors present a threat, but almost exclusively to humanity, and after stopping them, only then is the Reaper threat reconsidered and reintroduced. The Collectors turn tail and run when a single colony's defense systems start firing on their ship that just so happens to be their only way out of the galactic core. It's hard to imagine them being any semblance of a challenge if even one or two warships manage to intersect them. The stakes just aren't the same. It feels much less like a sequel to the first game and more of an interlude between the first and the third game's plot threads. The Collectors working for the Reapers into building a human Reaper for some odd reason feels like a shoehorned way to make sure the Reapers aren't forgotten as the main antagonists of the entire series. Why are they even doing this? Were the Reapers just bored with their minions and wanted to try a new experiment while they're floating through dark space on their way to the Milky Way? Much of Mass Effect 2's attempts to raise the stakes and make the story
Dark space.
comes from a lot of forced drama and emotional conflict that does little to drive the overarching narrative forward. Not much unlike how the Collectors feel like a bit of a forced antagonistic force until the Reapers arrive. Shepard dies? That's okay, he's back. The elusive man leads us into a trap? Big shock, but whatever, we still work for him. The Collectors abduct the entire crew out of nowhere when all of a sudden Shepard needs to take the shuttle coincidentally with every one of his squad but nobody else in Normandy, which for some reason the Collectors didn't just destroy again? That's fine. EDI does most of their jobs. Shepard's working for Cerberus? People will protest or make some kind of argument, but it makes little difference. The way Shepard talks about how the Alliance abandoned him just highlights how forced some of these arguments are. They didn't abandon you, my guy. You were literally dead. Cerberus's ambition to revive Shepard is probably something nobody would ever have been insane enough to think of. Anyone who judges Shepard for working with them might have forgotten the fact that they literally brought him back from the dead. So it wouldn't hurt if he at least repaid the favor or decided to hear them out. But no, they're evil because the game needs them to be. Cerberus has shown to do some inhumane things in both games so far, make no mistake, but Shepard dying and being revived to work for them just seems to be an excuse to add unnecessary drama that has little substance or impact, especially by the time the third game comes around. Whether Shepard chooses to remain a Spectre in spite of his working for Cerberus, for instance, changes nothing about the game's story. It just adds a few lines of dialogue. It wouldn't be much of a problem if it didn't shove itself into the player's face so often, as if it was some kind of choice they made and need to suffer the consequences for it. I gave Mass Effect 1's narrative a little bit of flack for not being anything groundbreaking or all too original with the exception of its lore and characters, but Mass Effect 2 goes on a similar route. The putting together a team for a suicide mission is a trope that's been seen before, and with how insignificant the Collectors can seem in the face of machines that can exterminate an entire galaxy, it's hard to feel threatened by them after the opening act. They are a threat at first until it's shown that they'll turn tail at the sign of danger or anyone who could fight back, and when they don't even destroy the Normandy a second time, only kidnapping the crew, it makes me wonder what the hell they're even trying to do. Saren wasn't a spectacular villain, but he got the job done. The Collectors? Meh. But while Mass Effect 2 downgrades the scale of the story, it makes a light speed warp in its characters and dialogue, which brings us perfectly into one of Mass Effect 2's greatest narrative strengths, the writing and conversations. I'll say this right out of the gate. Mass Effect 2.
But then I began to smell my greatness.
Is.
Hey, everyone! This store discriminates against the poor!
Fucking.
We ended up holding a tiebreaker in her quarters. I had reach, but she had flexibility.
Hilarious.
Wanna dance? Watch this!
No thanks. I'm happy with just me and the music.
Seriously, this game balances its more mature themes with a cynical sense of humor brilliantly. Mass 1 had some strong writing and character moments with some humor sprinkled in, but holy shit, does the sequel kick it up to 11. Not only does the intriguing lore return, but we get new races, new sides of the galaxy, and new faces to discover them with. With 10 plus 2 DLC squad members, every one of them stands out from another visually and in their personalities.
I am the very model of a scientist Solarian. I've studied species Turian, Asari, and Batarian.
Every player is bound to have their favorites, and even ones that are initially unlikable or suspicious can inevitably become someone you trust and enjoy being around. Getting to know them after each mission, on the occasion that they're not in the middle of some calibrations, can lead to some charming character moments between them and Shepard. Mass Effect 2's squad is the highlight of its story both in the mission content and the quality of its writing. And even outside of Shepard's squad, there's still a decent number of really great characters, whether they're recurring or simply used for one scene. Some of the ones you've interacted or done something for in Mass Effect 1 make a return as well, emphasizing the interconnectedness of the story on not just a macro level with its hefty decisions, but also in who you talk to and how you treat them. It's a neat way to show that even some of the smaller choices from the first game, and now in the second, have a possibility of returning. Shepard himself is also a bit more fun to be around in Mass Effect 2. He still embodies the same sense of fearlessness and inspiring leadership, and how the player chooses to direct their Shepard can lead to a plethora of different satisfying outcomes. In spite of how Zestruk said that he wanted players to be surprised at Shepard's actions, there wasn't anything I would say that seemed far off from what I was intending to communicate. The only time I felt like there was a surprise was the interrupt actions, which finally make their debut after being conceptualized back in the first game. But even then, it's hard to say that the outcomes of some of these interrupts were really all that shocking considering the context they were given. Much less so than how the dialogue wheel can feel a little deceitful at times. That is to say that while there can be some inconsistencies in Mass Effect 2's dialogue wheel, just like the first game, the moments that they occur are few and far between. I never felt as though I was being intentionally misled.
I'm in no hurry. I want to know what makes you tick first.
Wait, what?
You don't need
No,
to know
I already romanced
You just
someone,
have
what
to
the
know where to
hell?
put it.
Paragon and Renegade make a return, but unfortunately their presence has been altered for the worse. In Mass Effect 1, there were clear ways of indicating the player's progression in either Charm or Intimidate, and they could choose to spend their points accordingly. Not only that, but it was never a necessity to get a decent ending for the main story, or getting everyone to live. I'll get to that in a second. Mass Effect 2 confusingly works on a percentage system. Charm and Intimidate are unlocked based on how many choices the player has made in either categories relative to how many were available. Meaning the actual points don't matter, the quantity of decisions do. If the player has made 70 Paragon choices out of 100 so far in the game, for instance, their Paragon score is 70, but you never see this score. This wouldn't be as much of an issue if the game was clear about this, or if the lives of squad mates weren't on the line based purely on these scores. While I don't mind it being used for side quests or convincing shopkeepers to give you a discount, not much unlike how Mass Effect 1 used it for optional conversations or an easy way out in some situations, it was never a necessity to get everyone to live. In Mass Effect 2, there are two arguments where the player is either given a choice of who to side with, or yell at both people arguing. If they don't have enough points, they lose loyalty to the squad member, because for some reason, the commander disagreeing with them in an argument after solving their life problems is enough for them to be petty and disloyal, so they're more likely to die in a suicide mission. Unless the player can force themselves down a binary path and suddenly convince them to be loyal. I shouldn't have to say this is terrible writing and game design. The concept of choice in Mass Effect 2 is nullified when the game judges your score based solely on the quantity of decisions you've made in a singular path, as opposed to how hefty these decisions are. If it's based on an absolute percentage, I have no idea why the hell these points even exist. The lack of clarity for this is god-awful. Contrast that with Mass Effect 1. Charm and Intimidate are separate meters that don't influence each other. As the meter grows, you unlock the ability to invest more points into either option. If during conversation an option is grayed out, it's safe to assume you don't have enough points. You might not know how much more you need, but at the very least you know your current value is not enough. The only time where someone's life is on the line and this is a solution is with Rex on Vermeer. Except it's not the only solution. If the player took the time to talk to Rex, get to know him, and took on his side mission to find his family's armor, he trusts their judgment and backs off without the player needing to charm or intimidate him. It's almost as if that's good game design. It rewards role-playing and exploration, gives a more clear indication of what the player might be lacking, and allows for them to make choices rather than force them down a singular path in a binary choice. Choosing whether you get Samara or Morinth, or if you scrap or activate Legion, is also arbitrarily put as a Paragon Renegade choice. While I can see the argument for the moral standpoints of these, it feels unnecessary when a lot rides on the quantity of decisions a player makes. Remember when deciding if Ashley or Kaidan lives was just a decision to make, and not divided by an attempt to make it tied to the game's morality system? I liked that. The percentage needed for Mass Effect 2 likely isn't as high as I think it is, but it's hard to take any chances when the game itself provides no way of showing the player their percentage or what is even needed if a choice is missed. It's not all doom and gloom in my opinion though. Whether it's interrupting or using the Charm Intimidate option on a conversation, the vast amount of options and how it ties into outcome or reactions, sometimes based on who is in your squad, is extremely satisfying in terms of quantity. The interrogation scene in Thane's loyalty mission, for instance, had me replaying it several times just to see what would happen, and although they inevitably reach the same goal, how one gets there is where a lot of fun is to be had.
That may go down in history as the shortest interrogation ever.
Like many other things in Mass Effect 2, the writing, dialogue, and interactions are a fantastic leap forward compared to its predecessor, but its morality system and how it ties into saving squad mates is a step backwards, only made worse with how it's the only option in getting every one of these wonderful characters to live. But I wouldn't care so much about it if I didn't like them, so I suppose it's just another way of reminding myself that Mass Effect 2's characters and writing, in spite of its slightly lackluster overarching narrative, are the game's peak. Before I wrap up this entire video, I want to take a moment to talk about the suicide mission in isolation, because this is what the story builds up to and the reason for doing anything in this game. What do I think of it all these years later? It's still pretty good. Throughout the game, it's made abundantly clear that not everyone will make it out alive, and this proves to be true in how squad members can start dropping before the team even reaches the collector base if the player hasn't invested into their story or into the ship's upgrades. One of them is more fun to do than the other. Regardless, the visuals and ship battle in the introduction of this act are a breathtaking bit of cinematography and color usage. While I don't appreciate having to fight a bullet sponge at the bottom of the ship at the start, at the very least it goes down pretty quick at this point in the game. Having the player decide on who to bring with them and who should be specialized in tasks is also a great way of adding weight to these decisions. Who Shepard chooses, and if they're loyal or not, can mean the difference between life and death, and if the player isn't careful, they'll see more of their friends die. Even as I made every decision I knew was right and would net me a victory, I still felt a little bit terrified that I would see one of my friends suddenly die in front of me. The first section with the specialist inside the valves is a wonderful bit of gameplay that allows the player to control the pace and flow of combat while still needing to bring things to an end as fast as possible, and this is made easier if they've invested in upgrades and built Commander Shepard right, making the difference between struggling against the collectors like they might have earlier in the game, or mowing them down like they're cannon fodder. The Seeker Swarms leaves a bit more to be desired because of how much slower it is, but the presence of both the collectors and the occasional husks do provide some neat variety. And then, there's the final battle. A human Reaper that looks like the Terminator. It's about as boring as a third-person cover shooter boss can get, and seems forced in at the last minute to be the game's attempt to remind us that the collectors are working for the Reapers. Why are they doing this again when the Reapers are on their way from dark space anyway? I don't know. Also, the elusive man comes out of nowhere to ask us to do what he wants. After clearly showing us he's not the most trustworthy guy in the universe, I didn't hesitate for a second to blow this place to hell and give this guy the middle finger, knowing it'd come back to haunt me in Mass Effect 3.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. I'm getting a lot of bullshit on this line.
Don't try my patience.
While it makes sense considering it's their base, the last section of the suicide mission is primarily just collectors and husks arriving on floating platforms to be gunned down. It's a consistent problem that Mass Effect 2 has, where the narrative reasons for fighting can range from okay to strong. The actual combat itself never tries to be something more than what the player is already used to. Even so, the sound design, atmosphere, writing, and tension of the suicide mission is still a joy to experience from start to finish. Mass Effect 2 does almost everything a sequel should, and this is clear right from the start with how BioWare handled the criticism from the first game. They wrote it down, organized it, and tried everything they could to implement these points of feedback. But the key word here is tried. While there were a lot of things fixed and changed for the better, some of its systems, like its exploration, or lack thereof, took a staggering leap backwards. Things like its morality system and dialogue choices were kept, but unnecessarily altered for the sake of drama and tension. Its story has some of the best written cast of characters ever to be seen in a video game, but its focus is more on them than its actual conflict, something that the first game handled a little better in my opinion. And the combat, while a dramatic improvement over the first, isn't fully realized in how the player could potentially interact with the environment and stages that surround them. I mean, there's a mission that takes place on a derelict Reaper and shows how its mere presence can affect the minds of people who are on it, and the game doesn't take advantage of it. It's satisfying, but it becomes formulaic by the time the game comes to a close. But for all of these criticisms and faults I will give Mass Effect 2, I can't deny that everything it does right is a wondrous step in the right direction. Mass Effect 1's systems left a lot to be desired, but was held up by its gripping universe and compelling characters. Mass Effect 2 builds on this foundation by significantly improving its gameplay and taking its writing to some of the best I've ever experienced. As a sequel, its heart was in the right place, but made just a few missteps along the way. Even so, Mass Effect 2 is still heralded as one of the greatest games of all time, and is likely to be the favorite of many in the series. And I would have to agree with both of these sentiments. It does so much right that I could never dislike the game for what I don't like about it. 10 years later, I still love it. And if BioWare was able to repeat this with the finale, the same kind of attitude they had when developing this game could take the series' final chapter above and beyond to be a truly legendary experience. It could, at least. Whether or not it did will be a topic for the next video. Though likely, you already know the answer. I'll see you next time. Quick review of the DLCs, let's go! Hammerhead. Its movement is a huge improvement over the Mako. When I first got my hands on it, I thought I would love this thing. Turns out it's as sturdy as wet cardboard and it kinda fucking sucks. All you do is strafe and fire homing rockets at bullet sponges, praying they don't hit you once. Project Overlord. Some of Mass Effect 2's finest storytelling on a small-scale event that unravels as a mystery and ties into the larger galactic conflict with a morally gripping decision at the end. This story caught me by surprise, but holy hell does it get dark at the end. The act of using the hammerhead to go between areas would be more fun if I actually liked using it, but it makes me wonder if this is what Mass Effect 2's planetary exploration could have been like. Lair of the Shadow Broker. It's awesome to see Liara again and solve the mystery of a character hiding in Mass Effect 2's background. His actual lair and boss fight leaves a lot to be desired, but I found the fight against Vizier to be pretty entertaining. Nice to fight another Spectre and see her survive a mushroom cloud. Arrival finally gives us the Reaper connection this game desperately needed, and a conversation with Harbinger and Shepard, but too brief and too short. The conversation, I mean. Other than that, the DLC is fine. Good way to transition into Mass Effect 3.